Hey everyone, I'm Jonathan Methestein, the Executive Director of California Common Cause. Thanks for joining us yet again for our third Lunch with California Common Cause. Today we're going to talk about disability rights and specifically access for voters with disabilities in California's elections. Between 15 to 20% of the voting age people have a disability, with the expectation that that number is going to rise in the coming decades. That's important because we know there are turnout disparities for voters with disabilities. Research shows that potential voters with disabilities vote at a rate 20 percentage points lower than voters without disabilities. And disability is intersectional. People with disabilities are more likely to be poor, more likely to be people of color, more likely to live in rural areas. People with disabilities are overrepresented in the homeless community. Securing access for voters with disabilities is critically important to building a democracy that includes everyone. It's also beneficial for the population at large because it makes voting and democracy easier to engage with and easier to access for everybody. We're going to be talking about all of those issues today with two very special guests who lead the voting rights work at a partner organization called Disability Rights California. Disability Rights California has been working with California Common Cause for years on election reform and election administration in California. Our first guest of the two is Fred Nisen, the supervising attorney for voting rights. Fred is based in Oakland, and Paul Spencer, a voting rights staff attorney. Paul is based in San Diego. Thanks to you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi.
So Fred, Paul, can you tell us why access in voting for people with disabilities is important to someone who's never really thought about accessible voting? And maybe give us a short summary of DRC's voting rights work.
Okay. So it's important to everybody because, like you said, you never know when you're going to disability. And some people can use the accessibility functions in their own place. If they don't have a disability, it might make it easier for them to vote. Like people who are getting older having vision problems. And if there's a ramp, it makes it easier for everybody to access.
Yeah, it's the curb cut effect, right? That the features that are meant to provide access for voters with disabilities or people with disabilities can be used by everyone to make life easier. And if people don't know what the curb cut effect is, please Google it. But it's the idea that curb cuts on sidewalks were originally meant for people with disabilities, but now everyone uses them. Moms, dads pushing strollers, runners, et cetera, et cetera. Paul, why don't you tell us a little bit about DRC's voting rights work and the major projects you have in front of you?
Sure. So for folks that don't know much about Disability Rights California, we are the state protection and advocacy system for people with disabilities. There's an organization like ours in every state. DRC's is pretty big just by nature of how large California is. And we're the biggest legal services provider in the state. We're big as far as legal services providers go, and we have a dedicated voting rights practice group, and Fred and I's work is statewide. So I mean, we're not just focused in the large urban areas. We're trying to make sure voting is accessible in the entire state. And then also for our work, we're not just making sure that polling places are physically accessible. That's really important, but it's beyond that, and we'll kind of get into that in this interview. But it's everything from the materials that voters receive in the mail. Like, are they accessible? What do county election websites look like? Are they usable? Are voters being offered voter registration properly? There's some state and federal laws that require voter registration opportunities for people with disabilities. Trying to make sure those are working. Trying to make sure that people are actually registered, they're engaged with the political process. We do a lot of outreach to voters with disabilities. We do a lot of advocacy to county election officials to try to make the process improve. And we do a little bit of poll monitoring, which we've collaborated with you over the years on, Jonathan, too, which is great. And we're also interested in making sure there's accessible voting equipment at every polling location or vote center in the state. And that it's a pretty big topic there, but we'll dig into it a little bit. But that's sort of in a nutshell what Fred and I do with Disability Rights California.
Yeah, we're going to talk about all those details of access and policy choices in California. But before we go there, I just want to ask, what motivates you? What inspires you to do this work personally?
Well, me, I personal motivation when I began voting. It was before 2000. Someone know accessible voting machines. Even though I could get to the polls, I had to tell a poll worker what I wanted to vote for.
So, Fred, let me just clarify. This was in 2000, is that what you said? Before 2000, you were able to go to the polls, but had to tell a poll worker what you wanted to vote for?
But because of the help of American vote, there were accessible machines that I could use independently, so I could vote without anybody knowing what I voted for.
Right. The Help America Vote Act mandates, you two should correct me if I'm wrong, but it mandates an accessible voting machine in every single polling place in America, right?
Like at least one.
So that was what enabled you to cast a private vote?
Yes.
Right.
And I didn't know what I was missing. So I did that. And one place started doing it for seeing other people get that feeling and the look on their faces motivate me.
Say that last part again, Fred.
The look on people's faces after they voted by themselves for the first time
Yeah.
is something else.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. Seeing the look on people's faces when they vote by themselves for the first time. That's amazing.
They feel part of the community.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Fred. So let's talk policy. And let's start with physical access. So when I was at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, we would run poll monitoring programs, and across California, across specifically Northern California and the Central Valley. And we found innumerable polling places that weren't physically accessible. And I have to admit, I was at some point a few years ago, I was under the mistaken impression that the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, requires that all voting sites be accessible to people with disabilities, but that's wrong. Can you share what the law does require with respect to physical access for voters with disabilities?
Back to the ADA, it only required that voting be accessible in any way.
That voting only be accessible in any way, and like in one way?
It could be, but however, and the state law require every polling place. State law requires every polling place be accessible unless the county has made reasonable efforts in a precinct and can't locate an accessible polling place.
Got it. So state law requires that polling places be accessible unless the county makes reasonable efforts and can't find an accessible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, so I mean, there are, so the Secretary of State is responsible for putting out physical accessibility guidelines that the county election officials need to follow. But those guidelines are based on one of the federal, it's the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act. That name is a bit dated for that federal law, but that law has the sort of the reasonable efforts language that if a county can't find any accessible polling locations in a given area, they're allowed to use inaccessible locations. But the county is supposed to do their best efforts to make modifications to facilities to make them accessible. And the county is also supposed to document if they can't find accessible locations in the area, they need to be able to prove it later. So, I mean, the idea is that inaccessible locations should be pretty rare.
Are they, Paul? I mean, in your experience, you've done poll monitoring work on election day in the past. How rare or not rare are inaccessible polling places in California?
It's sort of hard to say. I mean, there are 58 counties. This is an enormous state. I mean, we have a pretty good snapshot. Let's put it this way. Generally, most locations are accessible. But in particular, there are some counties that struggle to find accessible locations. And we've gotten a better window into the counties that have transitioned to using vote centers. We've really kind of seen the struggles they've had, especially in rural areas. But I will tell you, there's some scenarios, like I live in San Diego. In San Diego County, there's some really dense suburban housing tracts that the county election officials really struggle to find an accessible location, like in a precinct that's pretty much just private homes. So over time, they've been chipping away at it and finding more and more accessible locations. But in that case, you know, if a precinct of 1,000 people is just private homes, you know, there really is no accessible location within that area. So, I mean, that might be an example of, you know, if the county doesn't have a choice. But again, it's not ideal. Counties should be making efforts to try to have locations be accessible. And just for folks, why isn't a private home accessible? For example, like imagine your typical suburban home with a driveway. Like that lip probably isn't going to be wheelchair accessible. And also the garage itself is probably not that physically large. It's probably not big enough to accommodate a crowd, have enough space for the accessible voting equipment. But typically it's that driveway lip up into the polling location that's making things inaccessible or things that are difficult to modify.
Well, oh, go ahead, Fred.
But one thing that I found helpful is when DOJ monitors the Department of Justice. One very common to
So,
What?
in some ways, we're not the stick, like it's the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
But, we will definitely bring it to the attention of whoever we need to if there's a problem with accessibility.
So what makes, when you're poll monitoring, just share with our viewers, what makes a polling place accessible? You mentioned sort of the driveway lip. That's one thing, having enough space for voters with disabilities to be able to sort of move within the polling place, that's another. When you're poll monitoring to ensure access at a polling place, what are you looking for specifically?
So the guidelines have really specific requirements, like the width of highway doors. But I mean, just probably the common sense way to understand it is the location easy to access? Is it big enough? Is it wide enough? Is there enough room to turn around? And this is another one. Are the slopes when you approach these locations, are they too steep? And it could be also cross slope. We see that a lot. And why does cross slope matter? Like that's like that the sidewalk's angled to the side. It's not safe for people with disabilities using power wheelchairs, and also older voters. If you're using a walker or a cane, it's not safe. So that's what you're looking for. And also ideally there's accessible parking spaces, but not all locations are really required to have accessible parking. But I mean, that's where these physical accessibility standards are important. And also, like, I was observing and I saw the accessible voting equipment was set up properly, but it was too close to the wall. So if you were using a wheelchair, like you could go down this aisle, but you couldn't actually turn to use the machine. So that's sort of an egregious example. I think that's pretty rare. Or, actually, Jonathan, I think when we were you brought something to our attention in a poll monitoring effort where the accessible voting machine was set up properly, but the poll workers had actually put storage equipment underneath it. So you couldn't actually, like if you were in a wheelchair, you couldn't get close enough to actually use the machine because they were using it for storage underneath.
Yeah.
Like, it's that kind of thing. It's like sort of common sense stuff to make sure that you have enough room to be able to vote.
Our experiences doing poll monitoring was that the accessible voting machines were, in some counties at least, a problem over and over and over. They were present, but often they weren't turned on. They weren't turned on. They weren't functioning, or they were inoperable, or the poll workers didn't know how to use them. Their training is 3 or 4 hours of drinking from an information fire hose, and they're mentally, consciously or subconsciously triaging, right? And they're like, okay, what's the least important stuff that I don't need to retain right now? And operating the accessible voting machine is sometimes that. And honestly, we would walk into polling places at 10 a.m. and the accessible voting machine for voters with disabilities wouldn't be turned on. And the poll workers would say, listen, we were rushing this morning. We'll turn that on if anybody needs it. And the problem with that, of course, is that getting that machine turned on and operating might take half an hour. And so what you're doing is you're putting a time tax on voters with disabilities that other voters don't have to encounter, to make sure, because when they show up, you're finally going to go through the work of turning on the accessible voting machine they need to cast their ballot privately. So
I give some good news on that front. Like that has been the accessible voting movement's been a real problem, but some of that is dated back to the Help America Vote Act. Like counties bought this equipment in the early 2000s, and counties just didn't update it until 18 months ago? The Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, he decertified voting equipment and made counties make sure they had new updated equipment, and that has actually fixed a lot of the problems because the equipment is newer. Some of the problem with the poll workers is that, imagine your computer from 12 years ago. Like it's hard to troubleshoot and turn on and make work. So the equipment is newer, so that's addressed a lot of the concerns. But even with the new equipment, we still do kind of run into, poll workers don't really understand why that equipment is important. So that's something Fred and I do in our work. Like if we go to a poll worker training and speak briefly, like we're trying to win hearts and minds, like explain why the equipment's important, not really just give them a lecture on why state and federal law requires it, but really try to tell them a story like why this is important for people with disabilities. And we find that to be pretty effective. But go ahead, Brett.
One problem is that I'm not going to at gallery. There only is one machine, and the both houses don't help people about it. No, nobody asked. Nobody.
Right. So in a Voters Choice Act county, a vote center has to have 3 accessible voting machines at minimum. And in a non-Voters Choice Act county, which is 43 counties in California, it's only a requirement of 1. And that 1 is only useful to voters with disabilities if poll workers let them know it's there and are able to have it operating and functioning.
Yeah, I mean, we think of best practices for when a poll worker checks a voter and they say, would you like to vote on paper or plastic? Something like that to like actually tell the voter that that option is available. I will say, some of the new voting equipment counties have bought sort of looks like an iPad that people are comfortable with. So we have heard anecdotally that voters who might have a disability but don't consider themselves to be disabled, like if your vision was decreasing and you could use large font, people are comfortable doing that with their Kindles and iPads at home. So you can use that large font feature on the accessible voting machine. So we have heard anecdotally from county election officials that there is more interest in using the accessible voting machine, probably because it looks like a modern piece of equipment, not like a compact Presario from, a decade ago.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this touches on the point we made that Fred made at the very beginning, which is that access for voters with disabilities matters for all of us. I mean, Fred made the point that any of us could have a disability, and so it's a category that is that all of us could join, or a group all of us could join. But even folks who don't consider themselves as having a disability often find using accessible systems much easier to navigate. And so I just wonder if you can share a little bit about that. It really underscores that these are not issues for voters with disabilities to think about. They're issues for all of us to think about.
Like, we want websites to be accessible. And when a website's made accessible, there are certain features for people with disabilities, certain tech features, but there's also some basic stuff like how the colors are laid out, how the information is presented. It's just a lot easier to use. Also, when the voter information guide, the thing you get in the mail before the election, if that is made with good design, it's more accessible, but it's also good for everyone because it makes the voter information guide easier to understand. And also, like, we try to do things in plain language. So plain language is like a 6th grade reading level. You should try to make things into plain language to make it accessible, but that's good for everyone. So you don't have dense election jargon as you're trying to figure out how you're going to vote. So that kind of stuff is good. And also even ballot layout, like how a ballot laid out. I mean, it could be more accessible. And one maybe last version is if folks think about their vote by mail ballot, a lot of times you'll see a punched hole next to the signature line. Like, what is that for? That's actually to help you line up to sign the vote by mail ballot. But I think that's good for all voters because in the hole, you can actually see to make sure you put your ballot inside the envelope. So there's all these advantages when we're making things accessible that's actually good for everyone.
So how does California fare when it comes to access with disabilities? What is your overall opinion or grade, I guess, of California as it works to ensure that voters with disabilities don't face barriers to the ballot?
Are we saying objectively, or are we saying compared to the other states?
Well, give me both.
Okay.
Compared to other states, they got A.
Did you say compared to other states, it gets an A?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Everybody that's autism from other states, they're envious at us.
Yeah. Did you say would be envious of us?
They are.
They are. Okay, I got you. Now, but sounds like that there's a potentially a different scale here in California, and you see continuous room to improve.
Yeah, there's always things that could be better. Especially with voter registration. Like, the people are probably most familiar with there's voter registration opportunities at the DMV, and that's through the National Voter Registration Act, but it also requires voter registration opportunities at public assistance agencies that provide public assistance and state-funded programs that primarily serve people with disabilities. So it's a little lesser known part of the MVRA, but that's a really important opportunity for people to get registered to vote. Especially, like, the idea of that is maybe you're less likely to own a car. So they want you to still have the same opportunities to register to vote. And things are pretty good in California, but they're getting better. So Fred and I, as lawyers, we do different advocacy tools to try to improve how those services are offered. But that's an example of how things could happen. The DMV has gotten better in California. Like DRC advocated to get the DMV to install accessible computers in all their field offices. They're there. But we still think the DMV could improve how it offers services. Its website could be better.
Yeah, well, I'll just say that California Common Cause is part of a lawsuit, a long-standing lawsuit to get the DMV to offer voter registration as required under the NVRA. Now, our listeners, our viewers are probably not familiar with the NVRA, the National Voter Registration Act. They may be familiar with motor voter, same law. It's called motor voter because despite the fact that it requires voter registration be offered at public assistance agencies and agencies and offices that serve people with disabilities, it's mostly only known for the provision that requires automatic voter registration at the DMV. And it's been a long, hard fight by DRC, by the ACLU, and by others to get all these other agencies, including ones that serve people with disabilities, to offer voter registration as required. I want to transition very quickly, and Fred, I'll direct this question to you. Right now, California is set to send every registered voter a VBM ballot before the November election. But we're fighting, and DRC is fighting, for maintaining in-person voting opportunities. Can you share why in-person voting opportunities are important for people with disabilities?
Yeah, and I'll give you my favorite example.
Okay.
And done enough for me. 1 year I was not able to vote in person because I was out of town. I was voting by mail beforehand. I asked my mom to help me with this. It was that my mom was, well, every time I over to mom, she said, why are you voting for that? Why are you voting for him? So, that's why that feeling is why the secret ballot is important. You never know what to use it.
You never, yeah, that's right.
So, there's an in-person voting you can use. Yeah, accessible voting machines. Or if people that the main reason that I'm about in-person voting, and there had to be enough that people don't have to travel 2 hours and be able to call when happens a lot. Rely on someone to drive them or over the state.
Yeah, Fred, let me just jump in and say, I've had conversations for sure with people who aren't familiar with access for voters with disabilities, and they'll say, well, isn't a vote by mail ballot the right way to go because people with disabilities have a hard time getting to polling places? And this enables them to vote in their home. And the answer is just as you described. For some people with disabilities, they have to have assistance like you did from your mom in marking their ballot, and they lose the right to a private ballot. And who knows how they're being pressured or judged for how they want to vote. And right, exactly. And in a polling place, they have the opportunity to cast a private independent ballot on an accessible voting machine. But it's so important to place those vote centers, as you said, Fred, near public transit or other systems that allow people with disabilities to be able to travel there easily, because if people have to travel for hours, it's just not going to happen.
Can I add just one practical concern too, is that if you are lower income, if you've had to move addresses frequently, you might be less likely to get your vote by mail ballot in the mail, and you're going to need to go vote in person. And as some of the statistics you cited at the beginning, Jonathan, that can disproportionately affect voters with disabilities. So just as a practical concern, the in-person voting needs to be there for people that are going to need to vote in person because they didn't get the vote by mail ballot like they were supposed to. And I think that's going to be pretty widespread, actually, across the state. There's going to be a lot of people that fall into that bucket.
Yeah. And I'll add on the last thing on this subject. Mindy Romero was our guest for the first episode of Lunch with California Common Cause. And she noted that despite the presence of the pandemic, in her survey, 30% of California voters still plan on voting in person. Okay, it's a pretty substantial percentage. And almost 60% of voters with disabilities said that they would like to use an accessible voting machine if in a polling place. And so it's really, it really is an indicator that that in-person voting matters for access generally, but it particularly matters for specific populations of voters, including voters with disabilities. Let me just ask one last question here before we turn to questions with our viewers. If you're tuning in late, you're watching. I'm Jonathan Mehta Stein. I'm the executive director of California Common Cause. I'm joined by two attorneys from Disability Rights California. Fred Nisen is the supervising attorney for voting rights based in Oakland, and Paul Spencer is a voting rights staff attorney based in San Diego. How is COVID-19 impacting voting for people with disabilities?
I think Fred and I both took a deep breath there. I think in the end it's going to work out and we're going to make it accessible. But figuring out how to make it work has been very intense. The planning process, we've been engaging with the Secretary of State and county election officials and other voting rights advocates. I think the path that California is on is the right one. We're sending everyone a vote by mail ballot, and we are, the governor has an executive order out right now, and there's pending legislation to require what we think is a sufficient amount of in-person voting locations to provide the people that want to vote in person the opportunity to do so. And that's important because if there's only a handful of locations, they're going to get overrun on election day. It's because they're going to be too crowded. And crowded locations with long lines are not accessible. So I think we're on a path to pull it off in California. I like the general consensus of what California intends to do for November, but there's a lot of speed bumps on the way. And the primaries in other states in the last couple of weeks have been kind of scary for some of the election administration hiccups that they're not just more than hiccups that they were experiencing. So, but elections are, from election officials, they don't just plan the right before the election, they start way before. So this is the time they're intensely planning and handling logistics. But and admittedly, there are some challenges for them finding locations that are available for in-person locations and also recruiting enough poll workers. So, but the governor's executive orders tries to balance that by letting them have less locations, but need to be open for longer hours, but still in a sufficient number that we think it should be able to accommodate voters on election day, or ideally a couple days before election day. But maybe Mindy had pointed out in her research, and we've seen in other counties, that even when there is early voting available, the vast majority of people still show up on election day. So that's part of just something sort of changing how voters vote, and that takes time.
Right, right. Okay, let me go to our viewer questions. So we have one here. What are the biggest issues in elections nationally for voters with disabilities? How are those issues in other states different from the issues in California? Fred, do you want to take that?
One is voter ID.
One of them is voter ID laws.
The people with disabilities in the state find it hard to get an ID because of how rural it is, and they usually drive, so they don't have ID.
So voters with disabilities, some don't need don't or can't drive, and so they don't have ID, and so it's harder to get a voter ID, right?
Also, another one is accessible vote by mail. So California has a requirement for all county election offices to provide an accessible vote by mail ballot for voters. Most states don't have that. So basically what that is people with disabilities are allowed to, they can get a ballot electronically, they can fill it out on their home computer and then print and mail it back in. So, I mean, for example, if you were a person who's blind and uses a screen reader, you could use your screen reader on your home computer to fill out the ballot privately and independently and then print and mail it back in. There's still some accessibility concerns, but it's pretty darn good for some voters. It's a great accessibility feature. And California requires that now, but other states, they don't even require it. California, we still got some implementation hiccups. We're trying to make sure that voters are aware of it, that the education and outreach is better, and that the system works well. But I mean, as far as California's ahead there, because most states don't require that, or it doesn't seem like they're even on a path to require it.
So we call that remote accessible vote by mail in California. For short, we call it RAVBM. Paul, why don't you just repeat for our viewers one more time how RAVBM works, because I think it's interesting, and it's an example of how California is sort of the vanguard for other states across the nation.
So I just want to start with that RAVBM, remote accessible vote by mail, is not internet voting because you're not transmitting your vote electronically. So I just want to address the security concerns first. It's a secure system where voters with disabilities and also overseas voters can use this, but you are allowed to, you download a ballot from your county elections office onto your home computer, and then you can actually, disconnect it from the internet. From there, it becomes like a ballot marking device. Like you're using your computer to fill out the ballot, and then you print it and you mail it back into your county elections office just like you would a normal vote by mail ballot.
And it doesn't matter that you might be printing it on 8.5 by 11 paper. You're not printing it on ballot-sized paper,
yeah,
but that's not a problem.
Right. You print it on your home computer, and then the county is able to process it just like a normal vote by mail ballot.
Yeah. Now that requires people to have a printer, and a lot of people, particularly young people, don't have printers. So it's not a perfect system by any stretch of the imagination, but it's an attempt to create an accessible version of the vote by mail ballot.
Yeah, it's good, but it's not good for all voters, as you said. Like you got to have a computer, you got to have a printer. I don't have a printer.
Neither do I.
And then you might need assistance to get it into the envelope and mail it back. So there are some things that are less than perfect about it, but it is a good tool for a lot of voters.
In one day, when you get a vote by mail ballot, you get a return envelope. It's very important to use that envelope when you send back the accessible vote by mail services were to sign the envelope
Mhm.
with the home that Paul mentioned earlier.
So if you use the official envelope that comes with the remote accessible vote by mail envelope, the voter will have postage paid and it will indicate where to sign, which are keys to making sure your ballot is accepted.
That will be accessible for people who are blind.
Right, right. Okay, just a couple last questions here before we wrap up. First, are early vote sites set up to provide access for voters with disabilities, or is it just polling places on election day?
They're set up for, they all have to be accessible. So like the vote centers need to be fully accessible, just like the polling places. And part of the confusion there is vote centers are relatively new in California. So like, for example, the Secretary of State's guidelines just refer to polling places. So, but the vote centers do also have to be accessible. And then in a lot of counties that aren't doing vote centers, their early voting site is the county elections office, which typically should be in a public building that doesn't have any accessibility concerns. In most counties, it's in the county administration building. So that is a good, large, accessible location. But yes, they're supposed to be accessible. And the other thing we mentioned, vote centers are supposed to have 3 accessible voting systems, which we think is great because it gives some redundancy. And a voter with a disability doesn't have to wait while one person's using the machine. So that's good.
Right.
In,
Yeah, go ahead, Fred.
in November, every polling place will be early voting.
Right. In November, that's right. Via executive order. Oh, I'm sorry, Fred.
It's in the governor's order.
Yeah, exactly. In the governor's order, it mandates that every polling place be open for 3 days before election day, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and then election day. And there will be same-day registration at every one of those sites, and there will be at least one accessible voting machine at every one of those sites. Noel Andrews asks, I think a remote accessible vote by mail ballot, which again, a voter is receiving by email and printing using their own assistive technology, voting on using their own assistive technology that they're perhaps most comfortable with, more comfortable with than an accessible voting machine at a polling place, for example. Can it be printed at a library after the ballot is saved as a document to assist people who don't have printers?
Yeah.
It can.
Yes, it can. Okay, great.
Yeah.
And then one more question from Gary Ferdman, who asks, is it possible for the unemployment system to register voters? We're in an era in which more people are unemployed than any time in recent history. Are unemployment agencies required or covered under the National Voter Registration Act and thus offer voter registration opportunities?
I don't know. Do you, Fred? Because they're not. I don't think they don't primarily serve people with disabilities. So I mean, we're more focused on those agencies, but the unemployment office arguably is a state-funded agency that provides public assistance. So I think arguably it should be offering voter registration, but I don't know if it does or not.
And you're sort of seeing us laugh because in California, the definition of what is a public assistance agency is not super clear. And so in California, advocates have been arguing to the Secretary of State for years that a number of state offices and agencies and departments need to be covered and thus offering voter registration to their clients and customers. And there's been pushback and there's been lawsuits, and some of those have been successful. And so the range of departments and agencies that are offering voter registration is increasing over time because of the work of advocates. But even where an agency is covered, as you both know from your work with agencies serving people with disabilities, even after an agency is covered under the NVRA, the National Voter Registration Act, and thus is mandated to offer voter registration, it doesn't mean that they do it. And it doesn't mean that they do it well, and it doesn't mean that they take care to do it right. So it's an ongoing challenge, and it really underscores the need for continued attention to these issues. No matter how much progress we make in California, we still don't have, I say this basically every single week on our live stream, we still don't have a democracy, an electorate that looks like the state of California. and we have massive participation disparities on a number of different metrics. I want to thank you both for joining me today to talk about access for voters with disabilities. This is a great conversation. Fred Nisen and Paul Spencer from Disability Rights California, thank you for your time. You can follow Disability Rights California on Twitter at DisabilityCA. You can follow us on Twitter at Common Cause CA, and you can follow me at _Jonathan Stein. Remember to join Lunch with California Common Cause live every Wednesday at 12 noon Pacific. We'll see you next week. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.